The sun was sinking low behind the canyon ridges, turning the sky into a deep wash of orange and copper. The kind of sunset that made the frontier look almost peaceful if you didn't listen too closely. But that evening, the silence was wrong. It was heavy, expectant, the kind of quiet that gathers when people come not to witness life, but to watch something end. At the far edge of the settlement, where scrub grass thinned and dry earth cracked like old leather, a lone mesquite tree stood crooked against the wind. Its twisted branches cast long shadows across the ground. And tied tightly to its trunk, wrists bound with coarse rope, stood an Apache man. He was injured. Anyone with eyes could see it. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, dark with dried blood, and dust clung to his skin like a second layer. His head was slightly bowed, not in surrender, but in exhaustion. The rope cut deep into his wrists, and yet he did not struggle. He did not shout. He did not beg. Around him, a group of townsfolk lingered at a distance, whispering in low voices, as if speaking louder might make the act too real. Some leaned on rifles. Others crossed their arms, pretending their stillness was strength instead of uncertainty. A few men laughed quietly, though their laughter sounded hollow in the open air. "They say he raided a caravan," one man muttered. "Or stole horses," another replied. "No matter," a third said. "An Apache is an Apache." And just like that, the verdict had been sealed without a courtroom, without proof, without mercy. In the Wild West, fear often wore the mask of justice. The idea had come from one of the ranch hands: leave him tied through the night, let the wild beasts decide his fate. Wolves, coyotes, or whatever prowled the canyon after dark would do the rest. It was a punishment meant to look like nature's doing, a cruel distance from responsibility. No hanging rope. No gunshot. Just abandonment. As if that made it cleaner. The Apache man lifted his eyes once, scanning the horizon. They were not wild eyes. Not hateful. Just tired. Deeply tired. The kind of look that belonged to someone who had walked too far, fought too long, and lost more than anyone around him could understand. Yet the crowd saw only what they feared. Children were pulled back by their mothers. Shopkeepers stood in their doorways. A preacher watched from afar but said nothing. Silence, in moments like this, became its own kind of agreement. Among the onlookers stood Clara Whitmore. She had arrived quietly, her boots dusty from the trail, her shawl pulled close against the evening wind. Unlike the others, she did not stand with the crowd. She stayed a few paces behind them, near a weathered fence, watching with a stillness that came from years of surviving the frontier alone. Clara had seen hardship. She had buried a husband. She had defended her homestead against storms, hunger, and loneliness. The West had taught her that survival was not gentle. But even survival, she believed, had limits. And this was something else. Her gaze fixed on the bound man. She noticed the details others ignored: the steady rise and fall of his chest, the dried mud on his boots, the absence of rage in his posture. If he were the savage the townsfolk claimed, why wasn't he fighting the ropes? Why wasn't he cursing them? Instead, he stood in quiet endurance, as if the cruelty around him was not new. A rancher nearby spat into the dirt. "Leave him. Night will handle the rest." A few heads nodded. One by one, people began drifting back toward town, satisfied that justice, at least in their minds, had been arranged. But Clara did not move. The wind shifted, carrying the faint, distant howl of something deep in the canyon. It was still early, but the wilderness was already waking. The sound traveled across the open land, thin and sharp, like a warning whispered by the earth itself. The Apache man heard it too. For the first time, he lifted his head fully and looked toward the darkening hills. Not in panic. Not in despair. just in understanding. Clara's hand slowly hovered near the rifle slung over her shoulder. The sky dimmed further. Shadows stretched longer. And as the last of the townsfolk disappeared into the glow of lantern-lit streets, one truth settled heavily over the empty edge of the frontier. A man had been left to die not by beasts, but by people who convinced themselves they were different from them. The last wagon wheel creaked away into the fading light, and soon the open edge of the settlement was nearly empty. Lanterns flickered to life back in town, glowing like distant stars, while the canyon edge fell into a quiet that felt heavier than noise. Most people had returned to their homes, satisfied that the matter was finished. Justice, they believed, had been done, but Clara Whitmore remained. She stood beside the weathered fence, her fingers resting lightly on the rough wood, eyes fixed on the lone figure tied to the mesquite tree. The wind tugged at the hem of her skirt and carried dust across the dry ground, yet she did not step away. Something inside her refused to let her turn her back, even as reason whispered that staying meant trouble. Frontier life had taught Clara many things: how to mend a roof in a storm, how to fire a rifle when danger came too close, and how to bury grief without letting it consume her. But the hardest lesson she had ever learned was this: cruelty often disguised itself as necessity on the frontier. She had seen it before. Years earlier, when her husband was still alive, a traveling drifter had been chased out of town over a theft that was never proven. The man had begged for a chance to explain, but fear moved faster than truth. By morning, he was gone, and later it was discovered the stolen goods had been misplaced in a storehouse the entire time. No one spoke of it again. The frontier did not like to admit mistakes. That memory returned now, sharp and unwelcome. Clara shifted her gaze back to the Apache man. He had not spoken once since the crowd left. His shoulders sagged slightly, and the ropes binding him looked tighter than before as his weight leaned against them. The fading sunlight revealed the bruises along his arms and the deep scrape across his cheek. He was injured, yes, but more than that. He was alone. And loneliness on the frontier was often more dangerous than any weapon. A cold breeze swept down from the canyon, rustling the dry grass. The man's hair moved slightly with the wind, but he did not flinch. His stillness unsettled Clara more than anger would have. She expected defiance, curses, or at least a desperate plea for help. Instead, there was only silence and endurance. "Why aren't you fighting?" she whispered to herself, though he was too far to hear. Her boots pressed into the dust as she took a slow step forward, then stopped. She knew the risk. Helping him would not be seen as mercy. It would be seen as betrayal. The town was already tense, fearful of raids and rumors. And fear had a way of turning neighbors into judges overnight. Behind her, the faint sounds of the settlement drifted through the evening air. Laughter from a saloon, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, a distant dog barking. Life continued as usual, as if a man were not tied to a tree awaiting death just beyond the town's edge. Clara exhaled slowly. She studied his face more carefully now. His eyes were open, scanning the horizon now and then, not with panic, but with a kind of quiet awareness. When his gaze briefly met hers across the distance, there was no hatred in it, no threat, only exhaustion and something deeper. Resignation. It stirred something in her chest. She could not ignore. Most people in town saw only a label, Apache. To them, that word alone carried years of stories, warnings, and fear passed down around campfires and supper tables. But Clara saw a man wounded, bound, and left without a voice, and she knew something else the town refused to admit. Mobs were often wrong. A pair of ranch hands lingered nearby, preparing to leave. One of them noticed Clara still standing there. "You're wasting your time, Miss Whitmore," he called. "Best head back before dark. Coyotes will come soon enough." She didn't answer. The other man chuckled uneasily. Ain't your concern anyway. He brought this on himself. Clara finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. Did anyone hear him speak? Ask him what happened? The men exchanged glances but said nothing. Silence answered her question more clearly than words. They soon walked off, boots crunching on gravel, leaving her alone with the growing shadows. The sky deepened into shades of purple and gray. The air cooled, and with it came the distant, eerie call of something wild echoing from the canyon. The sound lingered, stretching across the open. Land like a warning carried on the wind. The Apache man lifted his head slightly at the sound. Clara noticed the movement immediately. He was listening, not with fear but with recognition. That was when the truth settled fully in her mind. The town believed they were leaving him to nature, but in reality they were choosing not to see his humanity. It was easier to let the wilderness decide his fate than to question their own judgment. Her hand slowly moved to the strap of her rifle, not to raise it, but simply to feel its weight. The metal was cold, steady, real, unlike the uncertainty swirling in her thoughts. She could walk away. No one would question her. No one would blame her. She would return home, light her lamp, and pretend she had never witnessed any of this. But as another distant howl rose from the canyon, and the shadows stretched closer to the bound man, Clara realized something she could not deny. Turning away would be easier, but it would also make her no different from the crowd that had left him there to die. Night did not fall all at once on the frontier. It crept slowly, like a secret spreading across the land. The last streaks of sunlight clung stubbornly to the canyon ridges while the valley below slipped into shadow. Clara Whitmore remained where she stood, her eyes drifting between the darkening horizon and the bound Apache man. The town's noises faded behind her, replaced by the restless sounds of the wilderness wind brushing through brittle grass, insects humming, and the distant cry of birds returning to their nests. Yet beneath those natural sounds lingered something heavier, doubt. Clara had heard the accusations earlier that afternoon. They had been loud, confident, and repeated often enough to sound like truth. He raided a caravan. He stole livestock. He attacked travelers. Each claim stacked upon the last until the story hardened into fact, even though no one had offered proof. That was the way fear worked on the frontier. A rumor, once spoken enough times, became stronger than evidence. She replayed the moment in her mind when the ranch foreman had first dragged the injured man into town. The crowd had gathered instantly, drawn by curiosity and suspicion. No one had asked where he was found. No one had asked why he was wounded. They had only asked what he was. Apache. That single word had been enough. Clara leaned against the fence post, her thoughts turning over the details she had quietly collected throughout the day. She remembered overhearing two cowhands near the water trough just hours before the crowd tied the man to the tree. "I'm telling you," one of them had muttered, voice low and uneasy. "That wasn't a raider's trail." The other had scoffed. Then why was he near the caravan route? Because he was following it, not ambushing it. Tracks were spaced out steady. Like a scout, not a hunter. Clara hadn't interrupted then. Frontier men rarely welcomed questions from a widow, especially when fear already had a firm grip on their judgment. But the conversation had stayed with her, settling into her thoughts like a stone dropped into still water. Now, watching the man's still form against the tree, those whispers returned with sharper meaning. She studied his posture again. His boots were worn but well mended. His belt carried no weapon now, but the faint marks at his hip suggested one had once been there, likely taken by the townsfolk. His clothing, though torn, was practical and travel-stained, not the chaotic appearance of someone fresh from violence. More importantly, there was something missing. Desperation. If he were guilty of a violent raid, would he stand so quietly? Would he waste energy conserving strength instead of struggling? Most men accused unjustly shouted until their voices broke. Yet he remained silent, as if speaking would change nothing. A memory surfaced suddenly. 3 days ago, a child had gone missing near the edge of town. The whole settlement had searched for hours, panic spreading faster than wildfire. Then, just before sunset, the girl had been found wandering near the dry creek bed, frightened but unharmed. Her parents had claimed she must have simply lost her way. The matter had ended there, quickly and conveniently. But Clara now remembered something else. The child had said, in a trembling voice, that a quiet man had pointed her back toward the trail. At the time, no one had asked more questions. Relief had drowned curiosity. Clara's gaze snapped back to the Apache man. Could it be the same person? The thought made her chest tighten. She stepped a little closer, cautiously, boots soft against the dust. The lantern glow from town barely reached this far now, leaving the area cloaked in deepening blue shadows. As she approached within clearer view, she noticed fresh rope burns on his wrists and the faint swelling along his ribs, signs of rough handling rather than resistance. He lifted his head slightly, noticing her movement. Their eyes met again. Up close, the exhaustion in his expression was even clearer. But there was also awareness, calm and watchful, as though he were measuring her intentions without fear or hostility. It was not the look of a man who had lashed out in blind violence. It was the look of someone who had endured misunderstanding before. Clara swallowed. "If you rated them," she murmured softly, more to herself than to him, "why didn't you run?" He said nothing. Perhaps he did not understand her words. Or perhaps he understood perfectly and saw no reason to defend himself before someone who had not yet chosen a side. Behind her, the wind shifted direction, carrying faint voices from town, fragments of conversation drifting through the dusk. Found him near the trail. Looked suspicious enough. Best not take chances. Suspicious enough. Not guilty. Not proven. Just suspicious. Clara's jaw tightened. The frontier often operated on assumption rather than truth. Survival demanded quick decisions, but quick decisions without fairness could become cruelty disguised as caution. People feared raids, yes, but fear had a way of turning every unknown figure into a threat. She remembered the cowhand's earlier whisper again, following the caravan trail, not attacking it. What if he had been tracking something? What if he had been helping? Her heart began to beat faster, not from fear of the man tied to the tree, but from the growing realization that the entire accusation might have been built on fragments of misunderstanding and old prejudice. The Apache man shifted slightly against the rope, wincing as the movement strained his injuries. Still, he made no attempt to plead, no attempt to explain. It was as though he already understood the weight of the judgment placed upon him. And perhaps he knew something Clara was only now beginning to grasp. On the frontier, truth did not always matter as much as the story people chose to believe. The sky darkened further, and the first distant howl echoed from the canyon once more. Clara looked from the shadows to the bound man, her mind no longer clouded by uncertainty but sharpened by a troubling possibility. If the town had been wrong, if this man had been accused not for what he did, but for what they feared he might do, then they had not only condemned an innocent man, they had abandoned the very truth that could have prevented the next real danger from reaching their own doors. The last ribbon of daylight disappeared behind the canyon ridge, and with it went the illusion of safety that the sun always seemed to provide. Darkness settled slowly across the frontier, not as a sudden blanket, but as a creeping shadow that swallowed color, distance, and certainty. The sky deepened into a vast stretch of indigo, and the first stars began to pierce through the fading glow, out near the mesquite tree. The world grew quieter, too quiet. Clara Whitmore remained hidden behind a low ridge of dry earth and scattered brush. Her lantern dimmed and set beside her boot. She had not returned to town. She could not. Something stronger than fear held her in place, a quiet resolve that refused to loosen its grip. The Apache man was still tied to the tree, his silhouette now a dark shape against the open land. The ropes pulled his shoulders back unnaturally, and though he shifted slightly now and then, exhaustion clearly weighed on him. Every small movement seemed deliberate, careful, as if he were conserving what little strength he had left. The wind changed direction. It came down from the canyon in a long, steady breath, carrying with it the scent of dust, dry grass, and something sharper, something wild. Clara stiffened. She had lived on the frontier long enough to recognize that smell. Predators followed scent. Blood, weakness, and stillness were invitations written in a language the wilderness understood better than any human law. A distant howl rose from the canyon. It was low at first, almost mournful, then answered by another farther away. The sound echoed across the open land, stretching thin and eerie beneath the vast sky. Coyotes, most likely. Perhaps wolves. Creatures that survived not through cruelty, but through instinct. Unlike men, they did not pretend their actions were justice. Clara's fingers tightened around the stock of her rifle as she listened. The night air grew colder, and the grass rustled in uneven waves, disturbed by unseen movement beyond the darkness. Her heartbeat quickened, each pulse loud in her ears. Out by the tree, the Apache man slowly lifted his head. He had heard them too, but he did not thrash. He did not shout. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the canyon, eyes scanning the shadows with calm awareness. It was the reaction of someone familiar with danger, someone who understood that panic wasted precious energy. That quiet composure unsettled Clara more than fear would have. A lesser man might have begged by now, might have cursed the town, screamed for mercy, or fought the ropes until his wrists bled worse than they already had. Yet he remained steady, breathing slow and controlled, as if preparing himself for whatever came next. Another sound broke the silence. A faint crunch, then another, not loud, not careless. Careful steps moving through dry brush. Clara leaned forward slightly, narrowing her eyes into the darkness beyond the tree. At first she saw nothing, only shifting shadows and the sway of grass in the wind. Then, slowly, shapes began to form at the edge of her vision. Low, lean figures moving in a wide circle. Eyes glinted faintly in the dark. The predators had arrived. They did not rush. They never did. The pack kept its distance, observing, testing, waiting. One shape crept closer, nose low to the ground, catching the scent that had drawn them from the canyon depths. Another circled farther out, silent as smoke drifting over earth. Clara's breath grew shallow. This was exactly what the townsfolk had intended. No rope, no bullet, no visible act of killing. Just a man left helpless until nature complet. The night had fully taken hold of the frontier, wrapping the land in a deep, watchful darkness broken only by starlight and the faint silver glow of the rising moon. The mesquite tree stood like a lonely sentinel against the open plain, and beneath it, the bound Apache man remained still, surrounded by the quiet tension of approaching danger. Clara Whitmore lay prone behind the ridge, her rifle pressed firmly against her shoulder, her cheek resting against the cool wood of the stock. She could feel her heartbeat through the weapon, steady but heavy, each pulse echoing the weight of the choice before her. Below, the circle of predators tightened. Low shapes moved through the grass, cautious but deliberate. Their patience was nearly gone. Hunger sharpened their instincts, and the scent of blood and weakness lingered in the air like an invitation they could not ignore. One coyote crept closer than the rest, paws silent, body low, eyes fixed on the helpless figure tied to the tree. The Apache man noticed it immediately. Even in the dim light, Clara could see the shift in his posture. Not panic, never panic. Instead, he straightened as much as the ropes allowed, planting his feet more firmly in the dirt as if preparing to face whatever came. His chest rose and fell slowly, controlled, measured. He did not shout for help. He did not beg the darkness for mercy. He simply endured. That quiet strength struck Clara harder than any cry could have. The animal edged forward another step. Its muscles coiled. Its head dipped lower. A soft growl rumbled from its throat, barely audible but filled with intent. Behind it, the rest of the pack watched, waiting for the first move that would turn hesitation into attack. Clara's finger slid onto the trigger. Her mind raced. If she fired, the shot would echo all the way to town. People would ask questions. They would know she had stayed. They would know she had interfered with what they had called justice. Helping him could mean suspicion, anger, even isolation in a place where community often meant survival. But if she did not fire, her gaze locked on the rope digging into the man's wrists, the dried blood on his shoulder, and the quiet way he lifted his head toward the approaching predator without fear, only awareness. This was not a battle between man and beast. This was the final moment of a punishment he never chose. The coyote lunged. Time seemed to slow. Clara inhaled sharply, steadying the rifle, aligning the sight with practiced precision. Years of frontier living had taught her that hesitation could cost lives. Her hands stopped trembling, replaced by a calm clarity that came only in moments of true decision. The crack of the rifle split the night. The sound thundered across the canyon, sharp and final. Birds burst from nearby brush, and the echo rolled through the hills before fading into silence. The leading predator dropped instantly, collapsing into the dust before it could reach the tree. For a heartbeat, everything froze. Then chaos followed. The remaining animals scattered in startled bursts of motion, retreating into the grass and shadows, their confidence shattered by the sudden violence of the shot. Another quick movement in the brush made Clara shift her aim, and she fired a second time, not to kill, but to warn. The echo rang out again, louder in the stillness. The pack vanished. Silence returned, but it was no longer the same silence as before. It was lighter now, broken as though the night itself had stepped back. Clara exhaled slowly, lowering the rifle just slightly. The sharp scent of gunpowder lingered in the air, mixing with the cool wind drifting down from the canyon. Her heart pounded hard in her chest, but her mind felt strangely steady. She rose from behind the ridge. Each step toward the tree felt heavier than the last, not from fear of the man she approached, but from the knowledge that this moment would change everything. The dry earth crunched beneath her boots as she walked into the open, her lantern swinging gently at her side, casting a warm circle of light through the darkness. The Apache man turned his head toward her. Up close, the exhaustion in his face was undeniable. Sweat and dust streaked his skin, and the ropes had left deep red marks on his wrists. Yet his eyes remained clear, alert, and surprisingly calm. There was no hostility in them, only quiet understanding. Clara stopped a few feet away. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The wind rustled the mesquite branches above, and somewhere far off, a distant howl faded into the hills, as if the wilderness itself had acknowledged the interruption. She set the rifle down within reach but not raised, then stepped closer with careful movements, making her intentions clear. From her belt, she pulled a small knife, its blade catching a faint glint of moonlight. "You're not dying here tonight," she said softly, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. The man watched her, breathing slow, as if measuring trust the same way he had measured danger. Clara reached the rope and hesitated for only a second. Then she cut it. The fibers snapped with a rough sound, and the tension released instantly. His arms dropped slightly, stiff and weak from hours of restraint. He swayed but did not fall. Instead, he steadied himself against the tree, wincing as circulation returned to his hands. Without a word, Clara unscrewed her canteen and held it out. He looked at it, then at her, and after a brief pause, accepted it with both hands, drinking carefully rather than desperately. Even in exhaustion, he showed restraint. That detail did not escape her notice. The lantern light illuminated both of them, now two strangers standing in the open frontier night, bound moments ago by circumstance, now connected by a single, irreversible act. Clara had fired a bullet not just at a predator, but at fear itself. And as the echoes of the gunshots faded into the vast silence of the canyon, one truth settled firmly in her heart. She had justified the judgment of an entire town to save the life of a man they had already decided deserved to die. For several moments after the ropes fell away, neither of them spoke. The night air moved gently through the dry grass, carrying the fading scent of gunpowder and dust. The mesquite tree creaked softly behind them, as if even it had witnessed the weight of what had just happened. The Apache man flexed his hands slowly, wincing as feeling returned to his wrists. The rope burns were deep and raw, angry lines across weathered skin. He did not complain. He did not collapse. Instead, he steadied himself with one hand against the tree. Breathing carefully, regaining control over his body one small movement at a time, Clara watched closely. Lantern light flickering across his face, up close. The details told a story the town had refused to see. His injuries were not the marks of a man caught in the act of violence, but of someone who had been handled roughly, dragged, restrained, and left without care. Dust clung to the edges of old wounds, and fatigue weighed heavily in the way he stood. Yet there was a quiet dignity in his posture that surprised her. He finished drinking from the canteen, and returned it without hesitation. His movements deliberate and respectful. "Thank you," he said slowly. His voice low and slightly rough, as though he had not spoken in many hours. His English was broken, but clear enough. Clara blinked, a little startled. She had expected silence, or perhaps a language barrier that would leave them in gestures alone. Instead, she found herself facing a man who spoke with careful thought, choosing each word as if it mattered. "You understand me?" she replied softly. He gave a small nod. "Enough." The wind shifted again, rustling the grass and reminding them both of where they stood, far from the safety of town, at the edge of a wilderness that did not forgive weakness. Clara glanced toward the canyon, then back at him. "You should sit," she said, gesturing to a flat patch of earth near the tree. He hesitated only briefly before lowering himself down, movement stiff but controlled. Even in exhaustion, he carried himself like someone trained to endure hardship without complaint. He pressed a hand lightly against his ribs, and Clara noticed the subtle tightening of his jaw. "You're hurt worse than you let on," she observed. He shook his head slightly. "Not worse. Just tired." The simplicity of the answer struck her. Clara knelt a short distance away, careful not to startle him. She opened a small cloth pouch from her satchel and pulled out a strip of clean fabric and a small tin of salve. Frontier life had made her accustomed to tending wounds her own and others. "I won't harm you," she said, her tone steady. He studied her for a long second, eyes sharp despite exhaustion. Then slowly, he extended his arm. Trust, she realized, was forming not through words, but through actions. As she gently wrapped the cloth around his wrists, she noticed something else. His hands were calloused in a way that suggested long travel and skilled work, not reckless violence. Scars marked his knuckles, but they were old, not recent. A man accustomed to survival, not chaos. "Town says you raided a caravan," Clara said quietly, not accusing, only searching. He frowned slightly, confusion crossing his face. No raid? Then why were you near the trail? He took a slow breath, glancing toward the distant hills before answering. Tracks, he said. Horses stolen. Not from one people. From many settlers, my people too. Clara paused mid-rap. You were tracking thieves? She asked. He nodded. 3 men. Move fast, hide sign. I follow many days. The pieces began to fall into place in her mind. The cowhand's whisper. The steady trail. The child who had been found near the creek, and the caravan? She pressed gently. His expression grew serious. I watch from ridge. Child wander away. Too close to canyon. A guide ba. Dawn came slowly to the frontier, pale light spilling over the canyon ridges and stretching across the dry plains like a quiet awakening. The stars faded one by one, replaced by a soft gray sky that promised heat later in the day. Birds began to call from distant brush, and the world stirred as if nothing unusual had happened during the night. But Clara Whitmore knew better. She stood near the edge of the trail that led back to town, her lantern now extinguished, her rifle resting against her shoulder. Beside her, Dakota walked with steady but careful steps. Though he was still injured, he carried himself upright, refusing to show weakness even after everything he had endured. You don't have to come, Clara said quietly as they paused on a small rise overlooking the settlement. Below them, the town was waking. Smoke curled from chimneys. A wagon rolled past the general store. A few ranch hands gathered near the well, their voices faint in the morning air. It looked peaceful from a distance, ordinary even. But Clara knew that peace rested on a fragile foundation. Dakota glanced toward the town and then back at her. If I run, he replied calmly, they believe guilt is truth. His words were simple, yet heavy with meaning. Clara nodded slowly. Running would only confirm their suspicions. Silence had already nearly cost him his life. Facing the truth, however dangerous, might be the only way to stop the cycle of fear before it hardened into something permanent. They began walking down the trail together. The first person to notice them was a stable boy who froze mid-step, eyes wide as he stared at the figure walking beside Clara. Within moments, whispers spread faster than wildfire. That's him. He was tied last night. How is he free? Heads turned. Conversation stopped. By the time Clara and Dakota reached the center of town, a small crowd had already gathered. Some faces showed shock. Others showed anger. A few revealed something closer to unease. The ranch foreman stepped forward first, his expression dark with disbelief. You cut him loose, he said sharply, not as a question, but an accusation. Clara met his gaze without flinching. Yes. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. He was left to die, she continued, her voice steady but firm. Without trial. Without proof. Without even asking what truly happened. A man near the saloon scoffed. We found him near the caravan trail. That's proof enough. Dakota remained silent, standing beside Clara, his posture calm despite the tension surrounding them. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not raise his voice. His stillness alone seemed to unsettle the crowd more than defiance would have. Clara stepped forward slightly. Did any of you ask him why he was there? She asked. No one answered. The silence stretched long and uncomfortable. Just then, a woman pushed through the crowd, holding the hand of a small girl. Clara recognized them immediately, the child who had gone missing days earlier. The girl peeked nervously from behind her mother's skirt, eyes scanning the gathering faces before landing on Dakota. Her grip tightened. That's the man, the child said softly. The crowd stirred, confused. The mother knelt beside her. Are you sure? The girl nodded slowly. He showed me the path when I was lost near the creek. He didn't come close, just pointed and stayed far away so I wouldn't be scared. A hush fell over the square. Clara's eyes moved from the child to the townsfolk. He wasn't stalking the caravan, she said. He was tracking stolen horses. From both settlers and his own people. He was trying to stop thieves that threaten all of us. The ranch foreman frowned. That's a convenient story. Dakota finally spoke, his voice calm but clear. 3 riders. Not tribe. Not town. They steal and hide tracks. I follow to stop them. His broken English carried no anger, only quiet certainty. An older rancher in the crowd shifted uneasily. We did lose 2 horses last week, he muttered. Thought they wandered. Another man added, and the Miller caravan said supplies were missing. Not attacked, just taken. Piece by piece, doubt replaced confidence. The townspeople began looking at one another, their earlier certainty crumbling under the weight of overlooked details. What had once seemed obvious now felt rushed, careless, and deeply unfair. The preacher, who had watched silently the day before, finally stepped forward. His voice was calm but heavy. Fear makes quick judgments, he said. But quick judgments are not always just ones. The foreman's shoulders sagged slightly, though pride still lingered in his expression. We acted to protect the town, he said, quieter now. And nearly killed an innocent man to do it, Clara replied, not harshly, but truthfully. Her words were not shouted. They did not need to be. The weight of them settled over the crowd like dust after a storm. Dakota stood quietly, not demanding apology, not seeking revenge. His restraint spoke louder than any accusation could. He simply watched, as if giving the town the chance to face its own actions. The little girl suddenly stepped forward, letting go of her mother's hand. She looked up at Dakota with innocent sincerity. Thank you for helping me, she said. Dakota inclined his head gently. That small moment shifted something in the air. The same people who had watched him tied to a tree now saw him through a different lens, not as a threat, but as a man who had chosen to help even when mistrusted. Shame flickered across several faces. Eyes dropped. Hats were adjusted nervously. Clara felt the tension ease, though not disappear entirely. Courage, she realized, did not come without cost. Some people would still judge her. Some would whisper. Standing against the crowd always carried consequences on the frontier, where unity was often valued more than truth. But as the sun rose higher and the harsh certainty of the previous day gave way to reflection, one truth became undeniable. The town had been forced to confront not just their mistake, but the danger of letting fear decide justice. And while forgiveness would take time, the first step had already been taken, not through force, not through anger, but through truth, courage, and the quiet presence of a man who chose dignity even when the world had denied him mercy. The days that followed were quieter than anyone expected. The frontier town did not change overnight. Fear, after all, did not vanish with a single truth, and guilt did not disappear with a single apology. But something had shifted, subtle, steady, and impossible to ignore. The same people who once whispered in suspicion now spoke in softer tones. Their certainty replaced by reflection. Takeo Day did not stay in the center of town. Instead, he remained on the outskirts, near the open plains where the land stretched wide and honest beneath the sky. It was not exile, nor was it full acceptance. It was a careful middle ground, built on caution but no longer fueled by hostility. And for Dakota, who had survived both the wilderness and human judgment, that quiet space was enough. Clara visited often. At first, her visits drew curious glances. Some townsfolk still murmured when she passed, their eyes lingering a moment too long. Yet no one spoke openly against her anymore. The truth revealed in the square had planted something stronger than rumor-accountability. One afternoon, as the sun cast long golden rays across the plains, Clara found Dakota studying a set of tracks pressed into the dirt. "More thieves?" she asked, stepping beside him. He nodded slightly. "Same riders. Careless now. Think no one follows." Clara crossed her arms, scanning the horizon. "Then the town's problem isn't what they feared. It's what they ignored." A faint hint of a smile touched Dakota's face. Together, they began quietly warning ranchers about the stolen horses and missing supplies. At first, the warnings were met with hesitation. But when a small ranch recovered 2 missing animals exactly where Dakota predicted the trail would lead, doubt slowly turned into respect. Truth, proven through action, traveled farther than any rumor ever could. Weeks passed, and the tension between the settlement and the nearby tribal lands eased in ways no one had planned. Dakota never demanded trust. He earned it the only way the frontier truly respected, through consistency, restraint, and results. He tracked dangers that threatened both sides, rustlers, predators, and wandering threats that cared nothing for borders or prejudice. One evening, the ranch foreman approached Clara near the well, his hat in his hands, his usual confidence replaced with quiet humility. "We were wrong," he admitted. "Fear made us act faster than wisdom." Clara studied him for a moment before replying, "Fear protects, but unchecked fear destroys." He nodded slowly, as though the lesson weighed heavier than any apology. Not long after, a small but meaningful gesture followed. A water trough was placed at the edge of town, not as a boundary, but as a shared space for travelers, scouts, and anyone crossing the frontier trails. It was simple, practical, and symbolic, a silent acknowledgement that cooperation was wiser than suspicion. Dakota noticed it the first time he returned from tracking the rustlers' trail. He looked at Clara. "Small change," he said. She smiled faintly. "Small changes last longer out here." The stolen horse thieves were eventually caught weeks later, cornered between canyon ridges after Dakota guided a joint search of ranchers and trackers. No grand celebration followed, only a quiet sense of relief. For the first time, settlers and a tribal tracker had worked toward the same goal instead of against imagined threats. And that cooperation did something far greater than stopping theft. It prevented future conflict. Children, once pulled back in fear at the sight of him, now watched from a safer distance with curiosity rather than terror. The little girl he had,